In 1988, a man stood on the edge of a driving range in San Diego and watched a teenager swing a golf club the wrong way and decided he was watching something special. That man spent years opening doors, making calls, vouching for a kid nobody else had noticed yet. That kid became Phil Mickelson. Now, decades later, that same man has broken his silence. And the first words out of his mouth weren't pride, they were regret. So here's what I want you to sit with for a second before we go any further. When someone helps build a legend and that legend later falls apart in public, do they owe the world an explanation? Or is regret just something people say to protect themselves? Once the story turns ugly, drop your honest take in the comments, because by the end of this video, you might answer that question differently than you would right now. And if this is your first time here, we take stories the golf world can't agree on and break them down until they make sense. Subscribe, because what he actually said is coming up next, and it's not what you're expecting. There's a man who hasn't spoken publicly in almost 40 years. Not because no one asked, because he didn't know what he'd say. He watched a kid swing a golf club for the first time and knew almost instantly that he was looking at something the rest of the world hadn't caught on to yet. So he made a decision that quietly changed the course of that kid's entire life. For decades, that decision was the proudest thing he'd ever done. Then Phil Mickelson's name started showing up in headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with golf. And the man who found him first started asking himself a question he never expected to face. He finally answered it, out loud, on record, and what he said isn't the story you think it is. That man's name has never been in a headline, but the kid he found has been in every golf headline that exists. In 1988, on a driving range in San Diego, he watched a teenager with an unusual left-handed swing and made a call that opened doors most young golfers never get near. That teenager was Phil Mickelson. For years, that decision was a quiet source of pride, something he mentioned at dinner parties, nothing more. Then Mickelson's name started appearing in stories that had nothing to do with trophies, and the man who once believed he'd spotted greatness started wondering what exactly he'd helped set in motion. So before we go further, ask yourself this. Well, wait, if you helped build someone up and years later their name became something people whisper about instead of admire, would you still take credit? Or would you want to disappear from the story entirely? Say your honest answer in the comments below. And if you're new here, we take golf stories nobody's fully explained and break them down properly. Subscribe, because what he said next is not what you're expecting. To understand what he actually said, you have to understand what he saw first. Phil Mickelson didn't arrive on that driving range as a blank slate. He'd been swinging a club since he was 18 months old, mirroring his father's motion so closely that he ended up playing golf left-handed despite being naturally right-handed and everything else. His father, a commercial airline pilot, built him a practice area in their backyard, a real sand trap, a real green, and used his flight schedule to get young Phil to as many junior tournaments as possible. By the time he graduated high school in 1988, Mickelson had already won 3 straight National Junior Player of the Year awards. He wasn't undiscovered. He was, by every measure, the most obvious talent in youth golf in San Diego, which is exactly why what this man saw mattered, not because he found a hidden gem, but because he recognized something even the people closest to Mickelson hadn't fully clocked yet: what that talent would cost and who it would eventually turn him into. That recognition is what led to Arizona State, to the scholarship, to the network of people who spent the next 4 years shaping a teenager into a golfer the entire sport would be talking about for the next 3 decades. We'll get to the exact words he used to describe that moment, but not yet, because the phrase he chose, the one he's spent almost 40 years sitting with, only makes sense once you understand exactly what came after 1988, what Mickelson became, and more importantly, what he didn't become, that everyone assumed he would, because greatness on a golf course was never actually in question. It was everything else. Everything else took decades to show up, but when it didn't arrive quietly. For most of his career, Mickelson was golf's most beloved figure. Outgoing, generous with fans, the exact opposite of the guarded superstar. 6 major championships, 45 PGA Tour wins, a reputation built on charm as much as talent. For 30 years, the man who found him in 1988 had every reason to feel proud and no reason to think twice about it. Then came the reporting, allegations of inappropriate behavior toward women connected to the tour. A club membership in Rancho Santa Fe revoked. A caddy partnership ended after more than 2 decades, each story landing separately, each one chipping away at a reputation that had taken 30 years to build. Here's the number that reframes all of it. 38. That's how many years passed between the day this man made his decision on that driving range and the day the first allegation became public. 38 years of silence, watching, saying nothing, because there was nothing yet worth saying. That silence is what makes his recent statement different from anyone else who's commented on Mickelson this year. He's not a journalist. He's not a former opponent. He's not someone with a grudge or a book deal. He's the one person who was there before any of it started, before the wins, before the wealth, before the version of Mickelson the public thinks it knows, which is exactly why, when he finally spoke, he didn't talk about golf at all. He talked about a moment in 1988 that he now sees completely differently than he did for the 37 years before it. It would be easy to make this simple. A mentor regrets mentoring someone who turned out flawed. Clean story, clean villain, clean ending. But that's not actually what he said. And it's not what this story is about, because Mickelson didn't become who he became in isolation. Every step from that driving range to the PGA Tour ran through a system of coaches, agents, sponsors, and institutions that built their own reputations on his success. Steve Loy, his longtime agent, Arizona State's golf program, sponsors who cashed in on his charm for 30 years without asking hard questions, an entire ecosystem that benefited every time Mickelson smiled for a camera. But here's what nobody's asked yet. If this many people spent decades profiting from the image, why is the man who found him first the only one who's said anything at all? Quick pause. I want to know your take on that specific question. Drop it in the comments, because it's the one detail in this entire story that most coverage has completely ignored. And if you haven't already, subscribe now, because the answer to that question is, what makes his statement matter more than anyone else's? Looking back now, one question becomes difficult to ignore. That's not an accusation against an institution. It's a question about what an institution allows to happen quietly for decades, as long as the wins keep coming. And it's the reason this man's regret isn't really about 1988 at all. It's about every year since that he stayed quiet. Staying quiet is one thing. Staying quiet through 3 specific moments is another. The first came in June, when Mickelson was quietly removed from the Farms Golf Club in Rancho Santa Fe following an allegation of inappropriate contact with a female employee. The club confronted him mid-round. His membership was gone within days. The second came weeks later when Ashley Perez, ex-wife of fellow golfer Pat Perez, went on record describing behavior from Mickelson she says left her feeling groomed. Text messages, inappropriate comments, an incident involving unsolicited images. The third was quieter than both. After more than 2 decades together, Jim Bones Mackay, the caddy who stood beside Mickelson for nearly his entire career, ended their partnership. No public explanation, no dramatic statement, just an ending. From here, people see the story in 2 very different ways. One version of this story says these are 3 unrelated incidents: a workplace dispute, a messy divorce fallout, a professional parting of ways, stitched together by people looking for a pattern that isn't really there. The other version says 3 people who spent decades close to Mickelson all quietly walked away within the same year, and that timing isn't coincidence, it's a reaction. Both readings exist right now, side by side, and neither one has been fully settled. What we do know is this: the man who found Mickelson in 1988 watched all 3 of these stories break in real time. And unlike the club, unlike Ashley Perez, unlike Bones Mackay, he didn't walk away quietly. He did the opposite. He finally spoke, and what he chose to say connects directly back to that very first afternoon on the driving range, he was away into something else. A question about what people see in a person early on and what they miss. And the honest answer is that nobody missed anything. Mickelson's talent was never the mystery. What happened after it is. Because the real record of Mickelson doesn't come from a mentor's regret. It comes from the reporting itself, from golf writer Alan Shipnuck, who spent months documenting accounts from multiple women describing a pattern of behavior stretching back years, and from Ashley Perez, who went on record describing what she calls being groomed by a man she initially believed was just being kind. Then another piece of the story emerged. When confronted directly, Mickelson told both Pat and Ashley Perez he was disgusted and embarrassed in himself. Not a denial, not a defense, an admission without ever naming what exactly he was admitting to. That's the actual bombshell. Not a stranger from 1988 breaking decades of silence, but a documented on-record pattern spanning the Farms Golf Club, the Perez family, and a caddy partnership of over 20 years, all collapsing within the same 12 months. 3 separate people, 3 separate stories, one admission that never fully explains itself, and that's the uncomfortable part of this whole story. Not who discovered Phil Mickelson, but how long it took for anyone close to him to actually say something publicly. Not in 1988, not for 30 years after, only now, when the silence finally became impossible to keep. So where does that leave this story? One version says Mickelson is a talented man who let 3 decades of charm buy him the benefit of the doubt for far too long, and the last 12 months are simply the bill finally coming due. The other version says this was never really about one person at all. It's about an entire sport that had every reason to look away for exactly as long as the wins kept coming. The truth is, both arguments have evidence behind them. What matters now is how history remembers everything that happened after the headlines. Here's my real question for you. Not about Mickelson, about you. After everything you've heard, do you think Phil's reputation can ever fully recover? Or has too much happened to ignore? Let me know below. Drop your city or country in the comments. I genuinely want to see how far this reaches. And while you're there, tell me which version of this story you believe. If breakdowns like this, the ones nobody else is willing to sit with this long, are what you want more of, subscribe now, because the next name on this list already has a file open, and it's someone you'd never expect.